Stand by for the premiere broadcast of a new series of talks called Living in the Atomic Age and presenting the distinguished English philosopher and author Bertrand Russell. And be sure to continue listening to ABC this evening for the important forum, America's Town Meeting at the Air. Each week, qualified experts are invited to town meeting to discuss a pertinent problem of our time. Tonight, Dr. Charles S. Johnson, president of Fisk University, and Mr. Stanley High, author and editor, debate the provocative question, are we losing our moral courage? For a thought-provoking program, hear America's Town Meeting this evening on ABC. The Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company presents the first in a series of 6 transcribed lectures entitled Living in an Atomic Age by the distinguished English philosopher, mathematician, sociologist, and author Bertrand Russell. The subject of the first lecture is Present Perplexities. Lord Russell.
The present time is one in which the prevailing mood is a feeling of impotent perplexity. We tell each other dreadful stories of atom bombs and hydrogen bombs, of cities exterminated, of Russian hordes, of famine and ferocity everywhere. But although our reason tells us that we ought to shudder at such a prospect, there is another part of us that enjoys it, so that we have no firm will to avert misfortune, and there is a deep division in our souls between the sane and the insane parts. In quiet times, the insane parts can slumber throughout the day and wait, but in times like ours, in time as well, and all rational thinking becomes pale and divorced from the will. Our lives become balanced on a sharp edge of hypothesis. If there is to be a war, one way of life is reasonable. If not, another. To the majority of mankind, such a hypothetical existence is intolerably uncomfortable, and in practice they adopt one hypothesis or the other, but without complete conviction. Uncertainty balks the impulse to every irksome effort and generates a tone of frivolous misery, mistakenly thought to be pleasure, which turns outward and becomes hatred of those who are felt to be its cause. Through this hatred, it brings daily nearer the catastrophe which it dreads. The nations seem caught in a tragic fate, as though, like characters in a Greek drama, they were blinded by some offended god. Bewildered by mental fog, they march towards the precipice, while they imagine that they are marching away from it. It must be said that the purely intellectual problems presented by the world of our day are exceedingly difficult. There is not only the great problem, can we defend our Western world without actual war? There are also problems in Asia and problems in Africa and problems in tropical America, which cannot be solved within the framework of traditional political ideas. There are those, it is true, who are quite certain that they can solve these problems by ancient methods. So limited is their intelligence and their imagination that they are never puzzled for one moment. All we have to do is to go back to the days of the Opium War. After we have killed a sufficient number of millions of Chinese, the survivors among them will perceive our moral superiority and hail us as saviors. But let us not be one-sided. Stalin, I should say, is equally simple-minded and equally out of date. He too believes that if his armies could occupy Britain and reduce us all to the economic level of Soviet peasants and the political level of convicts, we should hail him as a great deliverer and bless the day when we were freed from the shackles of democracy. One of the painful things about our time is that those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision. I do not think this is necessary. I think there is a view of man and his destiny and his present troubles which can give certainty and hope, together with the completest understanding of the moods, the despairs, and the maddening doubts that beset modern men. I have been speaking hitherto of public perplexities. But it is not these alone which trouble the Western mind. Traditional systems of dogma and traditional codes of conduct have not the hold that they formerly had. Men and women are often in genuine doubt as to what is right and what is wrong, and even as to whether right and wrong are anything more than ancient superstitions. When they try to decide such questions for themselves, they find them too difficult. They cannot discover any clear purpose that they ought to pursue, or any clear principle by which they should be guided. Stable societies may have principles that to the outsider seem absurd, but so long as the societies remain stable, their principles are subjectively adequate. That is to say, they are accepted by almost everybody unquestioningly, and they make the rules of conduct as clear and precise as those of the minuet or the heroic couplet. Modern life in the West is not at all like a minuet or the heroic couplet. It is like free verse which only the poet can distinguish from prose. Two great systems of dogma lie in wait for the modern man when his spirit is weary. I mean the system of Rome and the system of Moscow. Neither of these gives scope for the free mind, which is at once the glory and the torment of Western man. It is the torment only because of growing pains. The free man, full grown, shall be full of joy and vigor and mental health. But in the meantime he suffers. Not only publicly, but privately also. The world has what we believe and what we feel ourselves compelled to disbelieve. There are ways of feeling that are traditional and that have all the prestige of the past and weighty authority, and that yet are not adapted to the world in which we live, where new techniques have made some new virtues necessary and some old virtues unnecessary. The Hebrew prophets, surrounded by hostile nations and determined that their race should not be assimilated by Gentile conquerors, developed a fierce doctrine in which the leading conception was sin. The Gentiles sinned always and in all their ways. But the Jews, alas, were only too apt to fall into sin themselves. When they did so, they were defeated in battle and had to weep by the waters of Babylon. It is this pattern that has inspired moralists ever since. The virtuous man has been conceived as one who, though continually surrounded by temptation, though passionately prompted to sin, nevertheless, by almost superhuman strength of will, succeeds in walking along the straight and narrow path, looking meanwhile disdainfully to the right and left at those inferior beings who have loitered to pluck flowers by the way. In this conception, virtue is difficult, negative, and arid. It is constrictive and suspicious of happiness. It is persuaded that our natural impulses are bad, and that society can only be held together by means of rigid prohibitions. I do not wish to pretend that society can hold together if people murder and steal. What I do say is that the kind of man whom I should wish to see in the world is one who will have no impulse to murder, who will abstain from murder not because it is prohibited, but because his thoughts and feelings carry him away from impulses of destruction. The whole conception of sin has, as it were, gone dead, so far at least as conscious thought and feeling are concerned. Most people have not thought out any other system of ethics, and have not perhaps theoretically rejected the old system, but it has lost its hold on them. They do not murder or steal as a rule, because it would not be to their interest to do so, but one cannot say as much for their obedience to the seventh commandment. They have, in fact, no wish to conform to the ancient pattern. The publican thanks God that he is not as this Pharisee, and imagines that in so doing he has caught the point of the parable. It does not occur to him that feeling superior is what is reprehended, and that whether it is the publican or the Pharisee who feels superior is an unimportant detail. I should wish to persuade those to whom traditional morals have gone dead, and who yet feel the need of some serious purpose over and above momentary pleasure, that there is a way of thinking and feeling which is not difficult for those who have not been trained in its opposite, and which is not one of self-restraint, negation, and condemnation. The good life, as I conceive it, is a happy life. I do not mean that if you are good, you will be happy. I mean that if you are happy, you will be good. Unhappiness is deeply implanted in the souls of most of us. How many people we all know who go through life apparently gay and who yet are perpetually in search of intoxication, whether of the bacchic kind or some other. The happy man does not desire intoxication, nor does he envy his neighbor and therefore hate him. He can live the life of impulse like a child, because happiness makes his impulses fruitful and not destructive. There are many men and women who imagine themselves emancipated from the shackles of ancient codes, but who, in fact, are emancipated only in the upper layers of their minds. Below these layers lies the sense of guilt, crouching like a wild beast, waiting for moments of weakness or inattention, and growling envenomed angers which rise to the surface in strange, distorted forms. Such people have the worst of both worlds. The feeling of guilt makes real happiness impossible for them, but the conscious rejection of old codes of behavior makes them act perpetually in ways that feed the maw of the ancient beast beneath. A way of life cannot be successful so long as it is a mere intellectual conviction. It must be deeply felt, deeply believed, dominant even in dreams. I do not think that the best kind of life is possible in our day for those who below the level of consciousness are still obsessed by the load of sin. It is obvious that there are things that had better not be done, but I do not think the best way to avoid the doing of such things is to label them sin and represent them as almost irresistibly attractive. And so I should wish to offer the world something scarcely to be called an ethic, at any rate in the old acceptation of that word, but something which nonetheless will save men from moral perplexity and from remorse and from condemnation of others. What I should put in the place of an ethic is, in the old sense, is encouragement and opportunity for all the impulses that are creative and expansive. I should do everything possible to liberate men from fear, not only the conscious fears, but the old imprisoned primeval terrors that we brought with us out of the jungle. I should make it clear, not merely as an intellectual proposition, but as something that the heart spontaneously believes, that it is not by making others suffer that we shall achieve our own happiness, but that happiness and the means to happiness depend upon harmony with other men. When all this is not only understood but deeply felt, it will be easy to live in a way that brings happiness equally to ourselves and to others. If men could think and feel in this way, not only their personal problems, but all the problems of world politics, even the most abstruse and difficult, would melt away. Suddenly, as when the mist dissolves from a mountaintop, the landscape would be visible and the way would be clear. It is only necessary to open the doors of our hearts and minds, to let the imprisoned demons escape and the beauty of the world take possession.
You have just heard the first in a series of 6 lectures by Bertrand Russell entitled Living in an Atomic Age. This has been a transcribed feature of the Public Affairs Department of ABC in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation. Bertrand Russell will be heard next week at this same time. We invite you to listen. The program came to you from New York. This is ABC Radio Network.
In a moment, ABC presents the second lecture in the series by famous philosopher-author Bertrand Russell on living in an atomic age. And a little later this evening, be sure to hear the story of the coronation on ABC. Ted Malone and producer Blevins Davis are in London collecting fascinating facts and human interest stories. Tonight they describe the regalia of the coronation, the scarlet and gold coach, the jewel-encrusted crowns, the special robes. Our coronation reporters also interview the persons responsible for these royal props, silversmiths, jewelers, and coachmen, as well as the Duke of Norfolk, who is in charge of all coronation details. Don't miss another exciting story of the coronation tonight on ABC. In cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation, the Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company presents the second in a series of 6 transcribed lectures entitled Living in an Atomic Age by the distinguished English philosopher, mathematician, sociologist, and author Bertrand Russell. The subject of the second lecture is Obsolete Ideas. Lord Russell.
Human beings, ever since their fathers invented language, have allowed themselves to be dominated by tradition. This has been at once the main cause of progress and the main obstacle to progress. Consider it first as a cause of progress. Where should we be if each generation had to invent reading, writing, and arithmetic for itself? How should we get on if arts and crafts were not handed on? Even in the most progressive age, much the greater part of our activity is and must be based upon tradition. We may rebel against our parents' narrow-mindedness, but we can only rise above them by standing on their shoulders. But although respect for tradition and obedience to custom are necessary up to a point, most societies have carried them much too far, and some have brought themselves to destruction by this sole defect. Human beings change their ways much more quickly than animals do. Civilized men change their ways more quickly than uncivilized men, and modern civilized men change their ways more quickly than civilized men of former ages. Civilized societies during the last 150 years have radically transformed their physical environment, the methods by which they secure a livelihood, and the apparatus of comfort over and above the minimum necessary for survival. The prime cause of these changes has been a vast increase of knowledge and skill. The new techniques in the material realm demand, if they are to bring their full benefit in increase of human welfare, an accompaniment of new mental habits. It is in this respect more than in any other that our world falls short. In an age of machines and skilled scientific production, we retain the feelings and many of the beliefs that were appropriate to the ages of scarcity and primitive agriculture. The need of new political and social ideas is due to our increase of efficiency, both for good and evil. In the old days, many things that are now possible could not be achieved by any known means. Extreme poverty for the great majority was unavoidable. Population perpetually pressed upon the limits of subsistence, except when it was catastrophically diminished by famine or pestilence. Wars created aristocracies of conquerors who lived without compunction upon the labor of the vanquished. It was not until the French Revolution that this system began to be superseded by one involving less general misery. Now, in certain important Western countries, extreme poverty has almost disappeared. Famine is unknown, large-scale pestilences have yielded to medical science, and a low birth rate has made it possible to preserve a high level of prosperity when it has been reached. All this is new in human history. Struggle, fight, starvation, and premature death have been the lot of the great majority of human beings ever since there were human beings, just as they were the lot of the animals before them. The fundamental source of this beneficent revolution is scientific production and the scientific habit of mind which has given rise to it. Two other things, besides scientific methods of production, have been necessary, namely democracy and a low birth rate. But these by themselves would not have been sufficient and would scarcely have been possible without science, except for brief periods in exceptional circumstances. Though not sufficient to produce a happy community, they are necessary, and machine industry without them may lead to a new form of serfdom, quite as dreadful as anything in the gloomy annals of the past.
We hear much about the Western way of life and the need of defending it against the Eastern menace. But few in the West are clear as to the essentials of the Western way of life, or as to what makes it worth defending. If we were clear about this, our propaganda would be more effective, and we should have less need than we have at present to depend upon military might as our sole protection. What the West has discovered, though as yet the realization is incomplete, is a method by which practically everybody can have as much of material goods as is conducive to happiness, without excessive hours of labor, and with that degree of mental culture that is needed to make leisure delightful. This is rendered possible by the fact that one man's work can now produce much more than is required for one man's subsistence. But as yet, this system has only a precarious life. It is threatened from without by those whom envy renders destructive, and it is threatened from within by those who are still under the domination of beliefs and passions appropriate to a bygone age. The kernel of these beliefs and passions is the struggle for life. Where this struggle is now still necessary, it is necessary because men are misguided, not because nature is niggardly. In former times, if two men each wished to live on the produce of a piece of land which only yielded enough for one, they must either both starve or fight till one was killed. In practice, it was not single men who fought, but groups of men, called successively tribes, nations, coalitions, or United Nations. These considerations apply to the present East-West tension. The Russians believe, whether sincerely or not, that they can only prosper by first ruining the West. The West not unnaturally concludes that it can only survive by first... I will not for a moment deny that while these reciprocal sentiments exist, they make themselves true. If A and B each know that the other is after him with a pistol, they may consider general maxims about the desirability of cooperation irrelevant. The question for each reduces itself to the very simple one, which of us will kill the other first? But the difference between their interests is caused by their sentiments, not by any external natural cause. And so it is with the public enmities in the modern world. They have no justification in economic fact or sober self-interest, but result solely from the surviving pugnacity of mankind, which once served a purpose but is now merely antiquated. If Russia and the West each became convinced that the other had no hostile intentions, each would be spared all the expense of armaments, each would derive benefits from reciprocal commerce, each would escape from the dread of the atomic bomb and the destruction of large parts of the population. The motives of self-interest, which on each side promote hostile feeling, are merely a reflection of the exactly identical motives of self-interest of the other side, and are based on each side upon the assumption that the other side is irrationally inclined. Of course, human nature being what it is, this naked analysis would seem shocking to both sides. For wherever hostility exists, however obsolete may be its sources, it appears on both sides as a great moral crusade, in which it is the duty of every true man to uphold high ethical ideals. But all this is merely a part of the psychological camouflage by which Homo sapiens conceals from himself his own lack of wisdom. We cannot blame governments for our troubles, nor can they be cured by merely governmental action. What is needed is a change in the ordinary outlook of ordinary people. The change that is wanted is sometimes thought to be a moral change, but my own belief is that nothing is required beyond a just estimate of self-interest. I know that it is difficult to rouse enthusiasm for such a view. Suppose you said to a population, if you pursue course A, half of you will die in agony and the other half will live in squalor, whereas if you pursue course B, you will all prosper. And suppose that on this basis you conducted a great political campaign. What do you think would happen? All the earnest moralists would rise up and say, "Sir, your aims are base. There are more important things than material prosperity. Should a great nation shrink from suffering if it is incurred in a noble cause? Was it by such degraded self-seeking that our ancestors made our nation great? Perish the thought. Away with money grubbers. Let us live like heroes, and if fate so wills it, die like heroes." you will find that you are completely powerless against the mass hysteria so generated. You will find men pointing the finger of scorn at you as a coward, and you will be lucky if your cowardice does not lead to your being lynched, while the thousands who are lynching you contrast their inflexible courage with your baseball trickery. The popular fear of intelligence is one of the great dangers of our times. If teachers and educational authorities had more understanding of this sort of person, of the sort of person the modern world needs, they could within a generation produce an outlook that would transform the world. But their ideal of character is an old-fashioned one. They admire most the sort of character which would give a man leadership in a gang of pirates. And if you say that commerce is a different thing from piracy, they think you are soft and hope you are mistaken. All this is due to the persistence of old martial ideas that have descended to us from earlier ages. These ideas, I repeat, were appropriate to an age of unavoidable scarcity, but are not applicable to our own times, when whatever scarcity still exists is due to human stupidity and to nothing else. Consider the application of such a mentality to international banking, and you will not be surprised by the Great Depression which it produced while it reigned unchecked, nor by the belief of the Nazis that the depression would be curbed if only enough Jews were exterminated, nor by the Russian belief that we should all be rich if all the rich men were liquidated. None of these mistakes would have been made by men in whom intelligence was capable of controlling passion. None of them would have been made by men who understood that when different groups have different interests, it is because of unwise passions and not because of any physical fact. If we are to live happily with a modern technique, and it is possible for modern technique to bring a far higher level of happiness than was formerly possible, we must banish certain ideas and substitute certain others. For love of domination, we must substitute justice. For brutality, we must substitute intelligence. For competition, we must substitute cooperation. We must learn to think of the human race as one family, and further our common interests by the intelligent use of natural resources, marching together towards prosperity, not separately towards death and destruction. The mental change required is difficult and will not be achieved in a moment. But if the need is recognized by educators, and if the young are brought up as citizens of this world and not of a bygone world of predatory warriors, the change can be achieved within a generation, so that we may hope to save at least a portion of mankind from the universal destruction with which we are threatened by the pursuit of obsolete ideas.
You have just heard the second in a series of 6 lectures by Bertrand Russell entitled Living in an Atomic Age. Be sure to listen next week when the 3rd lecture will be presented by Lord Russell on the subject, The Modern Mastery of Nature. This has been a transcribed feature of the Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation. This program was presented from New York. This is ABC Radio Network.
ABC is presenting from London a series of pre-coronation programs, The Story of the Coronation, compiled and broadcast by Ted Malone and Blevins Davis. Tonight, our reporters interview the unpublicized personalities of the coronation, guardsmen, coachmen, musicians, and others, all of whom have many interesting stories to tell. For example, one of the royal seamstresses will tell you that the kind of stitches taken in the royal robe is a closely guarded secret. For colorful facts, listen tonight for The Story of the Coronation. And be with us on ABC on Tuesday morning for on-the-spot coverage of the coronation itself, and on Tuesday evening for coronation highlights. In cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation, the Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company presents the third in a series of 6 transcribed lectures entitled Living in an Atomic Age by the distinguished English philosopher, mathematician, sociologist, and author Bertrand Russell. The subject of the third lecture is The Modern Mastery of Nature. Lord Russell.
It is the nature of man to be in conflict with something. Some men are victorious, others are defeated. Those who are defeated, as a rule, leave few or no descendants. It follows that the psychology which is transmitted tends to be that of victors, and that where there is a 50-50 chance of victory, optimism will cause the chance to be overestimated. From the point of view of the survivors, this is fortunate. The point of view of the vanquished is forgotten. The contests in which men are engaged are of 3 kinds. They are conflicts of, first, men with nature, second, men with other men, and third. These conflicts are very different in their character, and with the history of man, their relative importance is continually changing. Of these 3 kinds of contest, the contest with physical nature is, in a sense, the most fundamental, since victory in this contest is essential to survival. Men who perish in a glacial epoch, or when hitherto fertile regions dry up, or when earthquakes engulf whole valleys, have lost their contest with physical nature. So have all those who die in famines and pestilences. Every victory over physical nature makes possible an increase in the numbers of the human species, and has usually been used mainly to this end. But in proportion as man masters his environment, his relations to his fellow men assume increasing importance, partly because the technique of mastery over nature involves social groups more coherent than those of the most primitive men, and partly because in proportion as the winning of daily bread becomes easier, a greater amount of energy can be set aside for the killing of enemies. There comes, however, a moment in human evolution when, owing to the growth of technique, men can become richer through agreement with previous competitors than through extermination of enemies. When this stage is reached, what may be called the demands of technique require a cessation or at least mitigation of the conflicts of man with man. When this stage is reached, it is in fact the stage which mankind has reached at the present moment, the conflicts that most need to be resolved are the conflicts of man with himself. The long ages of the other 2 kinds of conflict have molded human nature to a pattern formerly appropriate, but now technically obsolete. The ages of external warfare reflected themselves in an internal war in the soul. In this internal war in the soul, one part labeled the other sin and determined to vanquish it. But the victory was never so complete as in external conflicts, and after every defeat, sin would again rear its ugly head. This unending warfare within, which was originally a reflection of the warfare without, now became, on the contrary, a source of the warfare without. Sin is only part of my nature, but it is the whole nature of my enemies. So at least the old-fashioned moralist believes. And therefore the soul which is not at peace with itself cannot be at peace with the world, and external wars have to continue in order to hide from individual men that the real war is within. For these reasons, the war of man with himself is that which, at the end of human evolution, assumes supreme importance. Each kind of war should end in harmony. The conflict of man with physical nature is turned into a harmony in proportion as man learns the secrets of nature and thereby becomes able to cooperate with her. The conflict of man with man serves the purpose so long as there is no possibility of adequate food supply for all. But when the conquest of nature has secured the possibility of adequate food supply for all, and when the growth of technique
has made large-scale cooperation profitable, the conflict of man with man becomes an anachronism and should end in a political and economic unification, such as is sought by the advocates of world government. By this means, an external harmony of man with man can be established, but it will not be a genuine harmony until men have achieved a genuine harmony within themselves and have ceased to regard a part of themselves as an enemy to be vanquished. This, in a nutshell, is the history of man, past, present, and, I hope, future. Man has had an existence which is long in relation to historical time, but short in relation to geological epochs. Our first human ancestors were a very rare species. They lived under precarious conditions, exposed to the rigors of the weather, to the hostility of wild beasts, and to all the dangers of famine that could be caused by drought. The chief worry was as to food supply. It is estimated that each individual at that time required at least 2 square miles for his subsistence, and even with 2 square miles at his disposal, he would often be hungry, and not infrequently die from lack of nourishment. Gradually, however, man emerged from these precarious conditions by various stages: weapons, fire, language, domestication of animals, and finally agriculture. These successive inventions and discoveries made possible the existence of civilized communities. They supplied the whole fundamental apparatus upon which civilized man subsisted for a very long time. From about 3000 BC until less than 200 years ago, there was no technical advance comparable to these. During this long period, man had time to become accustomed to his technique and to develop the beliefs and political organizations appropriate to it. Towards the end of the 18th century, man entered upon a new phase, involving a change as fundamental as that involved in the adoption of agriculture. I mean, of course, machine production and the application of science to industry. Physical science, one may say, has existed as a powerful element in culture for about 350 years. Machine production has existed for about half that time. During the period since its invention, it has shown itself to be a revolutionary force of quite amazing intensity. As yet, this has been almost solely operative in man's relation to nature. But by revolutionizing man's relation to nature, it has destroyed the old equilibrium that existed in man's relation to other men and to himself. The revolutions that it demands in these two provinces are still to seek, and it is the fact that they are still to seek which is the main cause of the present troubles of the world. The specially human activities which distinguish man from other animals all depend upon the lessening of his bondage to physical nature. So long as he had to spend all his time in food gathering, he could not devote much of his energy to war or politics or theology or science. These things are offshoots of the productivity of labor. They depend upon the excess of one man's production over one man's consumption of food. The greater this excess becomes, the more possible it becomes for a man to devote himself to politics and war and culture and such luxuries. Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar, Socrates and Plato, Buddha and Mohammed, Leonardo and Bach, all were only possible because the food producers could produce more than they could eat. But when one considers such a community as the United States in the present day, one finds a new phenomenon, namely that the great majority of the population enjoy very many things over and above the bare necessaries of life, and yet, in spite of this, very large parts of the population are not engaged in production, whether agricultural or industrial. There are all the young people who are still being educated after they have become able-bodied. There are the armed forces. There are the journalists and all the people concerned in the production of reading matter. There are teachers, clergy, politicians, and functionaries.
All these people, from the point of view of primitive man, are luxuries. But a modern community would be impossible without at least some of them. The liberation from bondage to nature has left men in theory free to choose their own ends to a degree that was never possible at any earlier time. I say in theory, because impulses incorporated into human nature by long ages of training and natural selection remain to determine human action independently of present physical needs. What a nation can spare from increasing its own numbers, it devotes only in part to its own welfare. To a very great extent, it devotes its energies to killing other people, or preparing to kill them, or paying those who have helped to kill them in the past. Our new mastery over nature brings new responsibilities and new duties. If men prove incapable of this adaptation, the whole movement of science and scientific technique will have proved a misfortune, and perhaps will have taken man along a blind alley. While we were slaves to nature, we could allow ourselves a slave mentality and leave to nature decisions which must now be ours. This is difficult, since great parts of traditional religion and morality were inspired by man's bondage to nature, and the ways of thought and feeling that we acquire from our culture and from our early upbringing are hard to overcome, even when circumstances imperatively demand a different outlook. I am not pretending that man is omnipotent. On the contrary, I shall be concerned in subsequent broadcasts with the limits of human power. But I am concerned to say that these limits are much less narrow for modern scientific man than they were for our ancestors, and that no precise boundary can be set beyond which the limits cannot be made to recede. Innumerable facts of nature, which once were inexorable data, are now opportunities. Deserts are a challenge. Australian rivers can be made to flow from east to west instead of from west to east. Before long it will be possible to demolish inconvenient parts of mountain ranges, and I dare say that by means of radioactivity the polar ice will be melted. It will not be long before it becomes possible to travel to the moon. We already know how to combat many kinds of pestilence, and we may hope to eliminate other kinds before long. Our nomad ancestors, while they watched their flocks by night, observed the stars in their inexorable courses, and believed themselves subject to the influences of celestial bodies. Wind and storm, drought and heat, comets and meteors and plagues filled their lives with awe, and they hoped to escape by means of humility. Modern man does not combat plagues by humility. He has found that they are to be combated by scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge, in fact, gives the means, where there are means, of combating any extra-human enemy. But it does not give the means of combating the human enemy without, or the part of the individual soul which leads it towards death rather than towards life. The problems of man's contest with nature, insofar as they are soluble, can be solved by physical science. But they are not the only problems with which man is faced. For his other problems, other methods are necessary.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard the third in a series of 6 lectures by Bertrand Russell entitled Living in an Atomic Age. This has been a transcribed feature of the Public Affairs Department of ABC in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation, and the program came to you from New York. This is ABC Radio Network. Listen to another in the series of discussions by English philosopher Bertrand Russell on living in an atomic age. First, an important note. In response to popular demand, The Great Fraud returns to ABC tonight. It's a timely series of reports by Mrs. Ada Siegel, authority on the USSR and its people, which exposes the way the Soviet government constantly defrauds its citizens. Mrs. Siegel reveals false items printed in the Soviet press. She reports USSR developments in domestic and international policies since the death of Premier Stalin, and includes a forecast of future trends under the Malenkov regime. For a clearer understanding of Russia and its political policies, don't miss The Great Fraud a little later this evening on ABC. In cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation, the Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company presents transcribed the fourth in a series of 6 lectures entitled Living in an Atomic Age by the distinguished English philosopher, mathematician, sociologist, and author Bertrand Russell. The subject of the fourth lecture is the limits of human power. Lord Russell.
The humility of the ancient shepherds, who felt themselves subject to the influences of Pleiades, is no longer appropriate in the scientific world. But there is a danger lest it should be replaced by a species of arrogance towards nature, which can lead to great disasters. Man, however scientific he may be, is not omnipotent. He is hedged in by natural limits. By means of his knowledge and technique, he can diminish the narrowness of these limits, but he can never remove them wholly. Some astronomers try to cheer us up in moments of depression by assuring us that one fine day the sun will explode, and in the twinkling of an eye we shall all be turned into gas. I do not know whether this is going to happen, nor when it will happen if it does happen. But I think it is safe to say that if it does, it will be a matter outside human control, and that even the best astronomers will be unable to prevent it. This is an extreme example, and one which it is useless to think about, because there is no way in which human behavior can be adapted to it. It does, however, serve one purpose, which is to remind us that we are not gods. There are 2 very different elements in science: scientific knowledge and scientific technique. Those whom I am calling technocrats are interested solely in scientific technique, and the more extreme among them deny that there is such a thing as scientific knowledge, or indeed any kind of knowledge. There are many who think that the point of view of the technocrat suffices, or if at moments they feel it somewhat arid, they supplement it not by any doubt that can be entertained by a scientific inquirer, but by an unscientific form of arrogance, namely the belief that without the patience and without the submission involved in observing nature, we can arrive by a form of self-assertion at kinds of knowledge which science is incapable of supplying. This is megalomania. Man is neither impotent nor omnipotent. He has powers, and his powers are surprisingly great, but they are not so great as he might wish. But let us have done with these generalities. It is not the generalities, but their practical application with which I am concerned. How long will it be before the accessible oil in the world is exhausted? Will all the arable land be turned into dust bowls, as it has been in large parts of the United States? Will the population increase to the point where men again, like their remote ancestors, have no leisure to think of anything but the food supply? Such questions are not to be decided by general philosophical reflections. Communists think that there will be plenty of oil if there are no capitalists. Some religious people think that there will be plenty of food if we trust in providence. Such ideas are superficial, even when they are called scientific, as they are by the communists. Modern industry depends upon raw materials which are found at or near the Earth's surface. These raw materials are the product of past geological ages. For the most part, they are not being reproduced by any natural process. The elements were built up long ago by a process which we are just beginning to understand. At temperatures much lower than that at which they were formed, they entered into chemical combinations. At a certain stage, the Earth was at a temperature peculiarly suitable to the formation of complex chemical combinations, and at last, combinations were formed which had the properties that are characteristic of living matter. Living matter has a curious property which I have called chemical imperialism. In virtue of this property, when it is put into a suitable environment, it transforms a mass of dead matter into a mass of living matter. It is this property which has made organic evolution possible. There are in nature processes of synthesis. They proceed from the simpler to the more complex. The processes of modern industry do exactly the reverse. They use complex raw material and simplify it. So far, this process of simplification is in the main not reversible by scientific methods. It may be that it will become so. Many ages ago, the energy supplied by the sun's heat was transformed into luxuriant vegetation. The energy lay locked up in the layers of petrified tropical ferns until ruthless industrialists seized it and transformed it back again into heat. But the heat that we generate when we burn coal is not localized like the heat in the sun, and is not continually regenerated by atomic processes. It floats off into the atmosphere and becomes forever useless. There is no process in nature, and there is none imaginable to human ingenuity, by which heat, once diffused, can be reconcentrated, or by which, when diffused, it can serve any human purpose. All sources of energy upon which industry depends are wasted when they are employed, and industry is expending them at a continually increasing rate. Already, coal has been largely replaced by oil, and oil is being used up so fast that East and West alike conceive it necessary to their own prosperity to destroy the industry of the other. Modern industry, in fact, is a kind of rape. All the long geological and astronomical ages during which the materials which we find useful have been built up contribute a moment's blaze, a moment's frivolous exuberance. But when his fireworks are finished, what will become of industrial man? All this, of course, does not appear in practice in the tragic and catastrophic form in which I have been stating it. What we know is that the price of coal goes up, and we do not readily connect this fact with the second law of thermodynamics. If you look up this law in a textbook, you will learn that it states that entropy always increases, and if you are not a physicist, you will not be much the wiser. But the law can be stated more simply, and is stated more simply by proverbial wisdom. It states, in fact, that you cannot unscramble eggs. It deals with all the irreversible processes of nature. Some processes are reversible, some are not. If you travel from London to Edinburgh, you can also travel from Edinburgh to London. But if coal is used to make your train go, there is no way by which you can collect the heat which it generates and turn it back into coal. All industry depends upon such irreversible processes. It all uses up the earth's capital. Modern industry is, in fact, a spendthrift, and sooner or later must suffer the penalty of spendthrifts. I know that most people meet such considerations with a kind of facile optimism. They say, oh, the men of science are sure to think of some clever invention, and even if they don't, it will last my time. They feel like the proverbial Irishman who said, why should I do anything for posterity? It never did anything for me. But I am concerned in these talks with man, considered as a single creature with a single biography. I cannot be content with a brief moment of riotous living, followed by destitution. And however clever the scientists may be, there are some things that they cannot be expected to achieve. When they have used up all the easily available sources of energy that nature has scattered carelessly over the surface of our planet, they will have to resort to more laborious processes, and these will involve a gradual lowering of the standard of living. Modern industrialists are like men who have come for the first time upon fertile virgin land and can live for a little while in great comfort with only a modicum of labor. It would be irrational to hope that the present heyday of industrialism will not develop far beyond its present level. But sooner or later, owing to the exhaustion of raw material, its capacity to supply human needs will diminish, not suddenly, but gradually. This could, of course, be prevented if men exercised any restraint or foresight in their present frenzied exploitation. Perhaps, before it is too late, they will learn to do so. But this is a question of politics, and I do not wish, as yet, to consider the political aspects of our problem. So far, I have been considering the raw materials of industry, but the matter is far more grave as regards soil, which is the raw material of food. Ever since agriculture began, it has been carried on wastefully in most parts of the world. Where methods are completely primitive, the cultivator merely moves on after he has exhausted the soil of one piece of land. This requires, of course, a great deal of available territory, and even then only offers a permanent solution if the damage done to the soil by cultivation is temporary and not permanent. It is no wonder that men worshipped fertility divinities, or that they developed a belief in the magical efficacy of human sacrifice. But in former times, while the population of the globe was still sparse, the problem had not the tragic importance that it has in our own day. We all know that the price of food goes up, but most of us attribute this to the wickedness of the government. If we live under a progressive government, it makes us reactionary. If we live under a reactionary government, it turns us into socialists. Both these reactions are superficial and frivolous. All governments, whatever their political complexion, are at present willy-nilly in the grip of natural forces which can only be dealt with by a degree of intelligence of which mankind hitherto has shown little evidence. Man has existed for about 1 million years, and scientific technique for at most 200 years. Seeing what it has already accomplished, it would be very rash to place any limits upon what it may accomplish in the future. But scientific knowledge is an intoxicating draught, and it may be one which the human race is unable to sustain. It may be that, like the men who built the Tower of Babel in the hope of reaching up to heaven, so the men who pursue the secrets of the atom will be punished for their impiety by providing by accident the means of exterminating the human species, and perhaps all life on this planet. From some points of view, such a consummation might not be wholly regrettable, but these points of view can hardly be ours. Perhaps somewhere else, in some distant nebula, some unimportant star has an unimportant planet on which there are rational beings. Perhaps in another 1 million years, their instruments will tell them of our fate and lead them to agree on an agenda for a conference of foreign ministers. If so, man will not have lived in vain.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard the fourth in a series of 6 lectures by Bertrand Russell, entitled Living in an Atomic Age. The subject of Lord Russell's lecture tonight, The Limits of Human Powers. Be sure to listen next week when the 5th lecture will be presented by Lord Russell on the subject, Conflict and Unification. This has been a transcribed feature of the Public Affairs Department of ABC, in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation. Your program came from New York. This is ABC Radio Network. In a moment, another in the series of lectures by Bertrand Russell on living in the atomic age. The program, The Great Fraud, has returned to ABC. It's a timely series of reports by Mrs. Ada Siegel, authority on USSR and its people. Mrs. Siegel reveals false items printed in Pravda and Izvestia, the 2 principal organs of the Soviet press, explaining the purpose of the Soviet government in misinforming its people. She reports USSR developments in domestic and international policies since the death of Premier Stalin, includes a forecast of future trends under the Malenkov regime. For a clearer understanding of Russia's policies, don't miss The Great Fraud tonight on ABC. Ladies and gentlemen, in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation, the Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company presents transcribed the 5th in a series of 6 lectures entitled Living in an Atomic Age by the distinguished English philosopher, mathematician, sociologist, and author, Bertrand Russell. The subject of the fifth lecture is conflict and unification. Here is Lord Russell.
The science of economics has been wrapped around by the theorists in a series of many veils, which have caused the plain man to suppose that there must be something indecent about its naked form. I think the only thing to do in this predicament is to begin again at the beginning with matters of such simplicity that you may be indignant at hearing them mentioned. Economics in the past laid more stress upon competition than upon anything else. Competition, in the sense in which it was used in classical economics, depends upon the existence of commerce regulated by law. It has, in theory, nothing to do with that more primitive competition, which has become the function of armies and which decides the ownership of land. It exists, in theory, only within a fixed framework of law. Given a number of men who all independently produce a certain commodity and expect to live by exchanging it for other commodities, they will obviously all try to get as much of other commodities in exchange as they can. But each will be limited in his demands by the fact that his competitor may ask less. This limitation only arises when the producers of the commodity in question between them can produce more of the commodity that can be sold at a profit, or at any rate without loss. The whole system only works where there are law courts and policemen to enforce contracts. And as soon as the stage of primitive barter has been surpassed, there must also be a more or less stable currency, which is legal tender. There are all kinds of elaborate legal restrictions of methods of competition. You must not assassinate your leading competitor. This form of competition is the prerogative of the state. You are allowed to tell the public how good your product is, but you must not tell them how bad the other man's is. All sorts of wonderful things were thought to result from free competition. It was thought that at a given price, the better commodity would get the larger sales. And it was thought that any improvement in methods of production would enable the man who made the improvement to undersell his competitors. Thus, competition would result in improving quality and cheapening methods of production. There may possibly have been some small element of truth in this theory 150 years ago in the cotton trade. Certainly the production of wage earners was cheapened to the utmost, and so was the production of raw cotton by means of plantation slavery. The system worked admirably for the cotton operatives and the plantation slaves, but they did not write the economic textbooks. But gradually things ceased to work out as the classical economists supposed, though it was a long time before economists noticed this. Competition within a country belongs to an early stage in industrial development. In all the more important industries, the tendency towards virtual monopoly is irresistible, and there comes a moment when either the industries take over the state or the state takes over the industries. The former course is favored by those nostalgic devotees of the past who imagine that they are thereby serving the god of free competition. But the other course is the one which is increasingly being adopted in practice, even where in theory it is being avoided. Consequently, competition in the modern world is between nations, not between individual producers. The British, for instance, wish to sell motor cars in America. This is a governmental matter to be decided between Whitehall and Washington. Whitehall has to decide how much in the way of raw materials can be allocated to the manufacture of motor cars. And Washington has to consider how much irritation in Detroit is less harmful to the United States than the bankruptcy of the British government. If the British were too successful in the export of cars, the American government would raise the tariff. If they were too unsuccessful, it might conceivably suggest lowering the tariff. Modern industrial technique has made competition far less important than it used to be, and has made the different industries and different parts of the world far more interdependent than they formerly were. The emphasis upon competition has led many people to suppose that whatever is disadvantageous to A must be advantageous to B. This comes of thinking that competition is a more fundamental and more frequent economic relation than cooperation. But such a view is completely out of date, and where it persists, it is very harmful. Economic cooperation has two main forms. One is exchange, and the other is the fitting together of different stages in the production of one commodity. As for the first, it should be fairly easy to understand that if you ruin your customer, he will not buy as much from you as he did when he was prosperous. The other modern form of cooperation, namely that between different stages in the production of a given commodity, is more interesting and more complex in its workings. Modern industrial technique requires a great deal of very expensive fixed capital, which is only capable of certain uses. If the finished product which it is intended for is no longer in demand, this fixed capital becomes useless, and all the labor that has gone into producing it does nothing to increase the amount of consumable commodities. Modern methods of mass production require an immense amount of labor before they yield any return whatever in the way of finished products. But when they begin to yield a return, the return is very large. In the meantime, circumstances may have changed so that the product is no longer required. And in that case, the elaborate work of preparation is wasted. Consider the sort of thing that happened at the beginning of the Great Depression. Everybody had felt rich and had expected to be able to buy all sorts of expensive things. Preparations were made for producing all these expensive things. And then it turned out that the preparations had been excessive. The men who had made preparations for one sort of commodity could not sell their products, and therefore could not buy another sort of commodity. And so the makers of that other sort of commodity could not buy yet a third sort, and so the depression spread. Vast amounts of preparation for the production of commodities suddenly became useless. The men who should have been at work were unemployed, and in their turn could spend much less than had been expected. And so what had been expected to be the means of producing wealth became suddenly useless, and everybody was poor. In such a situation, everybody's apparent private interest is diametrically opposed to the public interest. The banks which have lent money are afraid that their debtors will go bankrupt, and therefore call in loans right and left, thereby causing the bankruptcy that they fear. Dread of disaster makes everybody act in the very way that increases the disaster. Psychologically, the situation is analogous to that of people trampled to death when there is a panic in a theater caused by the cry of fire. In the situation that existed in the Great Depression, things could only be set right by causing the idle plant to work again. But everybody felt that to do so was to risk almost certain loss. Within the framework of classical economics, there was no solution. Roosevelt saved the situation by bold and heretical action. He spent billions of public money and created a huge public debt. But by so doing, he revived production and brought his country out of the Depression. The principle which Roosevelt applied in the New Deal is the same principle which is now needed in international affairs. Although it seems paradoxical, it is nevertheless the fact that the way to avoid poverty is to spend. This, of course, does not apply to private individuals who cannot spend more than they have, but it does apply to governments, which alone have the privilege of not paying their debts. Americans have a great desire to sell their goods abroad, but they cannot do so unless foreign nations can afford to buy. I do not wish to say anything that may sound ungenerous about martial aid, but I shall only be repeating what its American advocates have urged when I say that it serves the interests of America as well as those of Europe. I do not mean only what is undoubtedly true, that it has halted the spread of communism in Western Europe. I mean that actually America is better off financially, owing to spending money on reviving Europe. I have spoken of the wastefulness of industrial plant lying idle, but the enforced idleness of human beings is even worse. Idle plant and idle human beings are alike useless, but the idle human beings also suffer. The older economic theory was quite unable to deal with the problem of unemployment. We now know, however, that they can be controlled. We owe this knowledge chiefly to Keynes. The broad principle is that governments must spend and encourage spending when private people feel inclined to save, and must encourage saving or compel it by means of taxation when private people feel inclined to spend. There is a general conclusion to be drawn from modern economic development, and that is that any nation which desires to prosper must seek rather cooperation than competition with other nations. The world is economically unified in a way in which it never was at any earlier period. And even in terms of hard cash, it is seldom profitable nowadays for one nation to ruin another. Nay, more, if another nation is ruined, it is almost always profitable for a nation which can afford it to help the ruined nation on the road to recovery. This is because, broadly speaking, nations are more important to each other as customers than as competitors, and also because unemployment is a waste of which the disadvantages are felt not only in the nation in which the unemployment exists, but in varying degrees throughout the world. Although Congress finds this a little hard to understand, many people in international organizations now realize this. A start in the direction of world economic cooperation, of a world where economic cooperation replaces competition, has already been made not only in the Marshall Plan and the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, but also in the Colombo Plan. This doctrine, which is promulgated by hard-headed economists for hard-headed reasons, encounters obstacles that are psychologically derived from the fetish of competition and inherited with far too little change from our savage ancestors who knocked each other on the head with clubs. If the modern economic system is to work, we have to learn a less pugnacious and more cooperative outlook than that which tradition has made familiar.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard the fifth in a series of 6 lectures by Bertrand Russell entitled Living in an Atomic Age. We invite you to listen next week when the last lecture will be presented by Lord Russell. The subject has been a transcribed feature of the Public Affairs Department of ABC in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation. The program came to you from New York. This is ABC Radio Network.
In a moment, Living in an Atomic Age. Stay tuned. The Great Fraud is a timely series of reports by Mrs. Ada Siegel, authority on the USSR and its people, which exposes the way the Soviet government constantly defrauds its citizens. Mrs. Siegel reveals false items printed in Pravda and Izvestia, the 2 principal organs of the Soviet press, explaining the purpose of the Soviet government in misinforming its people. She reports USSR developments in domestic and international policies since the death of Premier Stalin, and includes a forecast of future trends under the Malenkov regime. Don't miss The Great Fraud later this evening on ABC. In cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation, the Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company presents transcribed the last in the series of 6 lectures entitled Living in an Atomic Age by the distinguished English philosopher, mathematician, sociologist, and author Bertrand Russell. The subject of the last lecture is The Achievement of Harmony. Lord Russell.
I have been concerned in these lectures to set forth certain facts and certain hopes which these facts render rational. The facts concern the unification of mankind through modern technique and the liberation of mankind from bondage to excessive toil, which the inadequate techniques of the past rendered unavoidable. The hopes that are based upon these facts are hopes as to the general well-being that may be realized if mankind learn to practice the cooperation which modern techniques demand. There are, it is true, correlative fears, for which there is perhaps as good basis in the present state of the world as for the hopes that I have been setting forth. The technical unification of the world not only makes possible much greater general well-being than at any former time, if it is accompanied by economic and political unification, it also makes possible greater disasters than any known to even the worst of former times, if our technical skill continues to be devoted to disunity rather than unity. I have not, however, in these lectures, dwelt much upon the reasons for fear, since I do not think that it is through fear that we shall avoid the dangers that threaten us. Our world has too much of fear, and emphasis upon dangers is apt to lead to apathetic despair. What our world needs is the opposite. It needs rational, creative hope. It needs something positive to live for. It needs yes feelings rather than no feelings. If the yes feelings are as strong as a purely rational consideration allows them to be, the no feelings will melt away and become unnecessary. But if we dwell upon no feelings too much, we shall never emerge from despair. Let us allow ourselves to assume that mankind, whether through the lessons of a Third World War or through some less painful process, will have come to understand the community of interest which unites the human family. Let us consider what public institutions can do to bring about a happy issue in the 3 age-long conflicts of men, with nature, with each other, and with themselves. Let us begin with the conflict with nature. There will have to be an international authority controlling the production and distribution of food and raw materials. This authority must have power to prevent such wasteful agricultural methods as have produced the deserts in North Africa and the Dust Bowl in the United States. I come now to the conflicts of man with man. Here, the first thing to be coped with is war. While mankind are subject to the threat of war, especially by the deadly methods which science is perfecting, nothing good can be secure. There is only one way of making the world safe against war, and that is to have only one armed force in the world. When this has been achieved, there will no longer be danger of serious wars, unless they were to take the form of civil wars between different parts of the international force. To prevent this, measures which are not purely military will be required. There will need to be control over education in the sense that no country must be allowed in its schools to teach a predatory nationalism. The teaching of history everywhere should lay more stress upon the progress of man than upon national victories or defeats in contests with other nations. There should be interchange of students, so that many people, while still young enough to be not hardened in habits and prejudices, should become intimate with people of other countries and with their ways of thought and behavior. The edifice of internationalism in education should have at its apex an international university, open to able students from all countries, containing professors to whom the international ideal appeared important, and affording a refuge to able men who, like Einstein, were found displeasing to their compatriots for reasons disgraceful to those compatriots. I come last to the protection of the individual, both against the hostility of the herd and against his own fears. These two are more closely connected than is sometimes thought.
For herd hostility is usually the result of fear, and the fear that it expresses, though nominally directed outwards, has, as a rule, its root in a fear which the intolerant individuals feel of a part of themselves. Education in the very early years can do much to prevent the growth of underground terrors, such as psychoanalysis lays bare. Affection and security are what is mainly needed in the early years. A population wisely handled in youth will be less liable to herd hostilities than is now common in most parts of the world. Nevertheless, it must be expected that herd hostilities will be sometimes aroused in cases in which, to the outsider, there seems no just ground for such hostilities. The best way of dealing with these cases would be to provide places of sanctuary, as was done in the Middle Ages. Those who had fled to such places should be examined by a neutral authority and should be protected if that authority pronounced them blameless. Regimentation and uniformity are dangers that an organized industrial world will have to fear, and against which it should take deliberate measures. There should be opportunities for exceptional individuals, such as poets and artists, who would be likely to fail in any attempt to win the approval of elderly bureaucrats. I should have academies for such men, not as a reward for achieved eminence, for then it is too late, but as expressing the favorable opinion of young men engaged in similar pursuits. I would have election to such academies only possible for men under 25, and I would confine the voting for election to members of the academy concerned who were still under 35. Such regulations might make it possible for the academy not to become an ossified collection of old fogies, as academies too often are. There should be for everybody considerably shorter hours of work than are now customary, and much longer holidays than are now enjoyed by anybody except university professors. Some people are afraid that in such a community life would be too tame and unadventurous, but this need not be the case. There are innumerable forms of adventure which could be open to everybody who desired them, if holidays were as long as they easily might be. For those who like danger, there should be every facility for opportunities of risking their lives, provided they did not at the same time risk the lives of those who prefer a less exciting existence. For those who wish at all times to live strenuously, and to whom a soft life feels disgusting, it should be possible to find a quite sufficient outlet in some really difficult work, whether of artistic creation or of scientific research. Such work stretches men's powers to the very utmost, as much in its way as an attempt to climb Everest. But for those who do not find it adequate, Everest still remains to be conquered. No society can be great without great individuals, and I should not think much of a world which had secured universal safety at the price of universal mediocrity. I think, however, that universal security, if it were attained by the kind of means that I have spoken of, would so much diminish envy and fear of eccentricity that the recognition even in the young of possible exceptional merit would not encounter the psychological resistance which it now has to meet in the great majority of mankind. If this is indeed the case, if such institutions as I have spoken of can be established, the happy world that I am envisaging can be not only happy, but glorious. I cannot believe that what is dark and dreadful and destructive in the souls of men is essential to the production of great works of imagination. I believe, on the contrary, that it lies within the power of man to create edifices of shining splendor, from which the glory and greatness of which human thought and feeling are capable shall spread a light unmixed with darkness,
filling men's hearts with joy and their thoughts with clarity. Such a world is possible. It rests with men to choose whether they will create it or allow the human race to perish in anger and sordid hate. Man, in the long ages since he descended from the trees, has passed arduously and perilously through a vast, dusty desert, surrounded by the whitening bones of those who have perished by the way, maddened by hunger and thirst, by fear of wild beasts, by dread of enemies, not only living enemies, but spectres of dead rivals, projected onto the dangerous world by the intensity of his own fears. At last, he has emerged from the desert into a smiling land, but in the long night he has forgotten how to smile. We cannot believe in the brightness of the morning. We think it trivial and deceptive. We cling to old myths that allow us to go on living with fear and hate. Above all, hate of ourselves, miserable sinners. This is folly. Man now needs for his salvation only one thing: to open his heart to joy and leave fear to gibber through the glimmering darkness of a forgotten past. He must lift up his eyes and say, "No, I am not a miserable sinner. I am a being who, by a long and arduous road, have discovered how to make intelligence master natural obstacles, how to live in freedom and joy, at peace with myself, and therefore with all mankind." This will happen if men will choose joy rather than sorrow. If not, eternal death will bury man in deserved oblivion.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard the last in a series of 6 lectures by Bertrand Russell entitled Living in an Atomic Age. This has been a transcribed feature of the Public Affairs Department of ABC in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation. Besides our fighting men in Korea, we have thousands of hospitalized veterans fighting for life. Your blood can help them. In addition, there's a daily demand for blood in civilian hospitals. And beyond all this, we need to build blood plasma reserves against the possibility of disaster or enemy attack. To meet and coordinate these needs, a national blood program has been set up with the Department of Defense, Civil Defense, and the Red Cross cooperating. You can help. Phone your local Red Cross for an appointment. It's easy and painless. Americans are rolling up their sleeves. Join them, won't you? This program came from New York. The Public Affairs Department of the American Broadcasting Company, in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation, presents transcribed Reflections on Being 80 by Bertrand Russell. For the past 6 weeks, ABC has presented Bertrand Russell in a series of lectures on the topic Living in an Atomic Age. In this series, Lord Russell outlined and discussed the problems confronting man living in this atomic age and offered his solution to the problems. In these talks, Lord Russell brought to bear all of his years of reasoning and contemplation. The culmination of his ideas regarding the world and mankind's place in the world was embodied in this series. He attempted to point the way for man by outlining the conflicts confronting him, by urging the understanding of these conflicts in order to bring about a community of interest that would unify the human family and bring about a peaceful and harmonious world. It'll be interesting, then, to discover the reasoning and thoughts whereby Bertrand Russell reached his conclusions. In May 1952, Lord Russell was 80. And so it is a fitting close to the summation of his ideas and world outlook presented in the preceding series to offer this talk this evening, wherein the eminent philosopher looks back over his 80 years, reflecting on his life's work and on the successes and failures of the goals he set for himself as a young man. In this talk, we are able to learn through Lord Russell's analysis of his own life how he attained the philosophical outlook concerning mankind and the world, which he presented in his summary of man living in an atomic age. And now, here is Lord Russell.
On reaching the age of 80, it is reasonable to suppose that the bulk of one's work is done, and that what remains to do will be of less importance. The serious part of my life, ever since boyhood, has been devoted to two different objects, which for a long time remained separate, and have only in recent years united into a single whole. I wanted, on the one hand, to find out whether anything could be known, and on the other hand, to do whatever might be possible towards creating a happier world. Up to the age of 38, I gave most of my energies to the first of these tasks. I was troubled by skepticism and unwillingly forced to the conclusion that most of what passes for knowledge is open to reasonable doubt. I wanted certainty in the kind of way in which people want religious faith. I thought that certainty is more likely to be found in mathematics than elsewhere. But I discovered that many mathematical demonstrations, which my teachers expected me to accept, were full of fallacies, and that if certainty were indeed discoverable in mathematics, it would be in a new kind of mathematics, with more solid foundations than those that had hitherto been thought secure. But as the work proceeded, I was continually reminded of the fable about the elephant and the tortoise. Having constructed an elephant upon which the mathematical world could rest, I found the elephant tottering and proceeded to construct a tortoise to keep the elephant from falling. But the tortoise was no more secure than the elephant, and after some 20 years of very arduous toil, I came to the conclusion that there was nothing more that I could do in the way of making mathematical knowledge indubitable. Then came the First World War, and my thoughts became concentrated on human misery and folly. Neither misery nor folly seems to me any part of the inevitable lot of man, and I am convinced that intelligence, patience, and eloquence can, sooner or later, lead the human race out of its self-imposed tortures, provided it does not exterminate itself meanwhile. On the basis of this belief, I have had always a certain degree of optimism, although, as I have grown older, the optimism has grown more sober and the happy issue more distant. But I remain completely incapable of agreeing with those who accept fatalistically the view that man is born to trouble. The causes of unhappiness in the past and in the present are not difficult to ascertain. There have been poverty, pestilence, and famine, which were due to man's inadequate mastery of nature. There have been wars, oppressions, and tortures, which have been due to men's hostility to their fellow men. And there have been morbid miseries, fostered by gloomy creeds, which have led men into profound inner discords that made all outward prosperity of no avail. All these are unnecessary. In regard to all of them, means are known by which they can be overcome. In the modern world, if communities are unhappy, it is because they choose to be so. Or, to speak more precisely, because they have ignorances, habits, beliefs, and passions, which are dearer to them than happiness or even life. I find many men in our dangerous age who seem to be in love with misery and death, and who grow angry when hopes are suggested to them. They think that hope is irrational, and that in sitting down to lazy despair, they are merely facing facts. I cannot agree with these men. To preserve hope in our world makes calls upon our intelligence and our energy. In those who despair, it is very frequently the energy that is lacking. The last half of my life has been lived in one of those painful epochs of human history during which the world is getting worse, and past victories, which had seemed to be definitive, have turned out to be only temporary. When I was young, Victorian optimism was taken for granted. It was thought that freedom and prosperity would spread gradually throughout the world by orderly process, and it was hoped that cruelty, tyranny, and injustice would continually diminish. Hardly anyone was haunted by the fear of great wars. Hardly any thought of the 19th century as a brief interlude between past and future barbarism. For those who grew up in that atmosphere, adjustment to the world of the present has been difficult. It has been difficult not only emotionally, but intellectually. Ideas that had been thought adequate have proved inadequate. In some directions, valuable freedoms have proved very hard to preserve. In other directions, especially as regards relations between nations, freedoms formerly valued have proved potent sources of disaster. New thoughts, new hopes, new freedoms, and new restrictions upon freedom are needed if the world is to emerge from its present perilous state. I cannot pretend that what I have done in regard to social and political problems has had any great importance. It is comparatively easy to have an immense effect by means of a dogmatic and precise gospel, such as that of communism. But for my part, I cannot believe that what mankind needs is anything either precise or dogmatic. Nor can I believe with any wholeheartedness in any partial doctrine which deals only with some part or aspect of human life. There are those who hold that everything depends upon institutions, and that good institutions will inevitably bring the millennium. And on the other hand, there are those who believe that what is needed is a change of heart, and that, in comparison, institutions are of little account. I cannot accept either view. Institutions mold character, and character transforms institutions. Reforms in both must march hand in hand. And if individuals are to retain that measure of initiative and flexibility which they ought to have, they must not be all forced into one rigid mold, or, to change the metaphor, all drilled into one army. Diversity is essential, in spite of the fact that it precludes universal acceptance of a single gospel. But to preach such a doctrine is difficult, especially in arduous times, and perhaps it cannot be effective until some bitter lessons have been learnt by tragic experience. My work is near its end, and the time has come when I can survey it as a whole. How far have I succeeded, and how far have I failed? From an early age, I thought of myself as dedicated to great and arduous tasks. 55 years ago, walking alone in the Tiergarten through melting snow under the coldly glittering March sun, I determined to write 2 series of books, one abstract, growing gradually more concrete, the other concrete, growing gradually more abstract. They were to be crowned by a synthesis, combining pure theory with a practical social philosophy. Except for the final synthesis, which still eludes me, I have written these books. They have been acclaimed and praised, and the thoughts of many men and women have been affected by them. To this extent, I have succeeded. But as against this must be set 2 kinds of failure, one outward, one inward. I have lived in the pursuit of a vision, both personal and social. Personal, to care for what is noble, for what is beautiful, for what is gentle. To allow moments of insight to give wisdom at more mundane times. Social, to see in imagination the society that is to be created, where individuals grow freely, and where hate and greed and envy die because there is nothing to nourish them. These things I believe, and the world, for all its horrors, has left me unshaken.
Thank you, Lord Russell. You've just heard a talk by the distinguished English philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell entitled Reflections on Being 80. A transcribed feature of the ABC Public Affairs Department in cooperation with the British Broadcasting Corporation. This is George Gunn speaking from New York. This is ABC Radio Network.